For about 2 decades, the United States government quietly paid people to spy with their minds. Not with cameras, not with satellites, not with microphones, but by sitting in a plain room, closing their eyes, and trying to describe a place they had never seen, sometimes on the other side of the planet. This is not a rumor or a late-night legend. The program was real. It was funded by the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. It had its own military unit, its own trained personnel, and a paper trail, most of which was eventually declassified for anyone to read. And here is the part that makes it so hard to file away. What that program found, and what it failed to find, is stranger than either side of the argument likes to admit. The believers overstate it. The skeptics wave it away. The actual record sits uncomfortably in between. This is the story of Project Stargate, the years America tried to build psychic spies, and the very ordinary-sounding verdict the files finally reached. This is the Long Archives, where we take the strangest government files and sort what's proven from what's only claimed. If you like your history careful, evidence first, hype labeled as hype, subscribe and stay to the end. To understand how a serious government ended up funding this, you have to remember how the Cold War actually felt. By the early 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a competition that ran far beyond missiles and tanks. It was a race in every domain at once: space, chemistry, computing, psychology, driven by a constant grinding fear that the other side might discover some decisive advantage first. In that climate, no possibility was too strange to at least check. And then American intelligence picked up something unsettling. Reports that the Soviet Union was pouring real money into parapsychology. Soviet institutes, the report said, had been running experiments in telepathy, mind over matter, and distant perception since the 1960s. Now, put yourself in the seat of an intelligence officer reading that. You almost certainly don't believe people can read minds or see across continents. But you have a job, and your job is to worry about capabilities the enemy might have that you don't. If there was even a small chance the Soviets were building some kind of psychic espionage tool, and you ignored it, that was a risk no one wanted to be responsible for. The logic was less, "We believe in this," and more, "We cannot afford to be the ones who didn't look." That single sentence explains almost the entire program. So the CIA started quietly funding research. The place it turned to was the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, a respected think tank in California. There, 2 physicists, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, began running experiments on what they would name remote viewing, the claimed ability to perceive a distant place using nothing but the mind. Note who they were. Not mystics, not fortune-tellers. Physicists working at a real institute, publishing and running structured tests. That respectability mattered. It was part of why the idea was taken seriously enough to fund for 20 years, and part of why the fight over what it proved has never fully ended. So what did the work actually look like? Not crystal balls, something much more clinical and, in a way, stranger for it. In a typical session, a remote viewer would be seated in a quiet room with a pen and paper. They would be given almost nothing to go on, often just a set of map coordinates or a sealed envelope, with no clue what the target was. Then they were asked to relax and report whatever impressions came: shapes, textures, feelings, fragments. Sketch what you sense. Describe the place you cannot see.
Look at that.
The idea was to strip away guessing and leave only the raw signal, if there was one. Over time, the program developed formal protocols for this, with steps and structure, trying to turn a vague notion into something that could be tested and repeated. Much of that structure came from a man named Ingo Swann, an artist and self-described psychic who worked with the SRI researchers and helped shape their central method. It was Swann who pushed the program toward what became known as coordinate remote viewing, the notion that a viewer needed nothing but a set of numbers, a latitude and longitude, to lock onto a place. The appeal? from an intelligence standpoint, is obvious. If it worked, you wouldn't need a photograph or a description to point the viewer at a target. You could simply hand over coordinates and get impressions back. Swan's protocols tried to impose discipline on something inherently slippery, breaking a session into stages so that the first raw impressions came before the conscious mind could start inventing a story. Whether or not any of it tapped a real ability, it was a genuine attempt to build a repeatable procedure rather than rely on gifted individuals having good days. The case that put remote viewing on the map came in 1974, and it involved a viewer named Pat Price. Given only geographic coordinates for a site in the Soviet Union, Price described a secret installation and reportedly sketched details, including a large gantry crane at a place that turned out to be a sensitive Soviet facility. Some of what he described was said to match reconnaissance imagery that came later. To the people running the program, this was electric. It looked for a moment like proof that a person in California could describe a guarded site thousands of miles away, with no physical access at all. The SRI researchers also, famously, tested a celebrity. In the early 1970s, Puthoff and Targ ran experiments with Uri Geller, the entertainer known for apparently bending spoons and reproducing hidden drawings, and even published results suggesting he could copy images sealed away from him. That study appeared in a serious scientific journal, and it drew fierce criticism almost immediately. Skeptics, including professional magicians, pointed out that Geller's stage act relied on exactly the kind of sleight and misdirection that a physics lab is poorly equipped to catch, and that the controls had gaps. The Geller episode became a preview of the entire program's problem in miniature. A striking result, produced under conditions that were not nearly as tight as they needed to be, followed by a long argument over whether anything real had happened at all. On the strength of results like that, the effort grew. It moved beyond the laboratory at SRI and into the actual intelligence and military world. A dedicated unit was set up at Fort Meade in Maryland. Soldiers and civilians trained to sit down and view targets on request. One of them, Joe McMoneagle, became known inside the program as Remote Viewer Number 1 and was eventually given a Legion of Merit. The citation crediting him with intelligence on a long list of targets. Over the years, the program passed through a string of code names: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally the one most people remember, Stargate. Across all of it, roughly $20 million was spent. For a while, it must have felt like the future. A real office, real budgets, real officers walking in with sealed targets and walking out with sketches. Whatever you believe about whether it worked, that part is simply history. For the better part of 2 decades, the United States government operated a unit whose job was to see at a distance with the mind. Hold on to that, because the next part is where the shine comes off. Because for every striking hit, there was an ocean of noise. And that is the part the exciting version of this story tends to leave out. The uncomfortable truth about remote viewing sessions is that most of the output was vague, ambiguous, or simply wrong. A viewer might produce pages of impressions, curves, water, something tall, a feeling of cold, that could be made to fit almost any location after the fact. And that phrase, after the fact, is the heart of the problem. When you already know what the target was, it is remarkably easy to look back at a messy sketch and highlight the parts that match, while quietly ignoring the parts that don't. Human beings are pattern-finding machines. Give us a rich, ambiguous drawing and a known answer, and we will find the hit almost every time. Not because it was there, but because we went looking for it. Skeptical researchers pressed this point hard and found something concrete. When critics went back over the original SRI remote viewing transcripts, they argued that the sessions were not as clean as they looked. Some transcripts, they said, contained subtle cues, offhand references to earlier targets, notes about times and places, that could quietly help a judge match a viewer's description to the correct location, without any psychic information at all. In one influential critique, researchers showed that once those cues were stripped out, the impressive matching rates could shrink dramatically. This is the unglamorous machinery of how a hit can be manufactured without anyone lying. Not fraud, but leakage. Small, ordinary pieces of information sneaking into a test that was supposed to be sealed. And it is exactly the kind of flaw that is invisible from the outside and devastating on close inspection. And when remote viewing was asked to do something that actually mattered, to deliver information that could drive a decision, the record is far weaker than the legend. Take the case often cited as a dramatic success. In 1981, an American general named James Dozier was kidnapped in Italy by a terrorist group. Remote viewers were tasked to help find him, and some reportedly named the city and offered details. But here is the plain fact. Their input did not free him. Dozier was rescued by conventional police work. This is the recurring shape of the operational story. Impressions that sound impressive in hindsight, but that no one could actually rely on in the moment, because there was never a way to tell the real signal from the noise until it was too late to matter. Then, in 1995, the whole thing was brought into the open. The CIA declassified the program and commissioned an independent evaluation from a respected research organization, the American Institutes for Research. They brought in 2 experts, deliberately chosen from opposite sides, to examine the data, and the result was one of the most honest and revealing splits in the history of the paranormal debate. On one side was a statistician, Jessica Utz, who concluded that the numbers showed a real, statistically significant effect, that in the controlled laboratory studies, some viewers scored measurably above pure chance, and that this could not simply be dismissed. On the other side was a psychologist, Ray Hyman, who agreed the statistics were anomalous but argued they proved nothing paranormal. The effects had not been reliably reproduced by independent labs, and until they were, claiming that ESP had been established was, in his words, premature. 2 careful experts looking at the same data, reaching 2 defensible and opposite conclusions. That is not a tidy answer. It is the real texture of hard evidence at the edge of what we understand. But underneath the scientific stalemate, the practical verdict was not ambiguous at all. Whatever the laboratory statistics did or didn't show, the program had failed at its actual job. In more than 2 decades, it had never produced intelligence that was useful in a real operation, nothing reliable enough to act on. And so, in 1995, the government shut it down. The reason given was as plain and deflating as any secret program has ever received. It simply wasn't useful. Step back, and the strangest thing about Project Stargate is not the psychic part. It is what the file, taken as a whole, actually tells us. Here is a serious government, in the grip of a real and rational fear, spending $20 million and 20 years chasing an extraordinary idea. And then, at the end, filing an honest, boring conclusion. Interesting in the lab, useless in the field, shut it down. The archive does not end with a cover-up or a bombshell. It ends with a shrug. And that shrug is, in its own way, more revealing than any dramatic revelation would have been.
Breaking news tonight.
It shows an intelligence apparatus willing to fund a long shot out of Cold War anxiety, and also, eventually, willing to admit that the long shot didn't pay off. The program's afterlife is almost as telling as the program itself. Once the files were public, the people involved did not vanish. They went on the record. Some former viewers wrote books, gave interviews, and built second careers around the very ability the government had just declined to endorse. The whole strange episode seeped into popular culture, most memorably in a best-selling book, later a Hollywood film, that treated the military's flirtation with the paranormal as equal parts sinister and absurd. And that is part of why the public memory of Stargate is so lopsided. The dramatic anecdotes make great stories, and the cautious government report does not, so the anecdotes are what survive. The declassified conclusion, careful, qualified, deflating, is far less fun to repeat than a tale about a soldier describing a Soviet base with his eyes shut. There is a real lesson buried in the Utz and Hyman split, too, and it reaches well beyond psychics. It is the difference between a curious statistical anomaly and something you can actually use. A small effect that shows up in careful lab conditions, that no one can reliably reproduce, and that no one can turn into a decision you'd stake anything on. That is not the same as a working tool. Science lives in exactly that gap, and so does self-deception. The hardest discipline is not detecting a signal. It is being honest about whether that signal is strong enough and repeatable enough to mean anything. Stargate is a 20-year lesson in that discipline, learned in public. And maybe that is why the story refuses to settle. Believers point to Pat Price and the gantry crane and say, something real happened there. Skeptics point to the mountain of misses and the failure to ever help in a live crisis and say, of course, it didn't work. Both are, in a sense, describing the same file, just standing at different ends of it. The honest position is the uncomfortable one in the middle. A real program, some genuinely puzzling results, no reliable ability, and a door that the official reviewers could not quite bring themselves to slam completely shut. If you like history that resists the easy answer in either direction, subscribe and you'll get a new entry from the archive every Sunday. So let us be exact about what is known. For roughly 2 decades during the Cold War, the United States government really did fund a secret program to test remote viewing, the claimed ability to describe distant places with the mind. It began with physicists at the Stanford Research Institute, grew into a military unit at Fort Meade, ran under a series of code names ending in Stargate, and cost around $20 million. In 1995, it was declassified, independently evaluated, and shut down, on the plain grounds that it had never delivered intelligence anyone could actually use. Everything else remains contested, whether any of the striking hits were more than coincidence, and whether the small laboratory effect one reviewer found was real, are questions the file leaves open, and questions that no reliable evidence has since answered in remote viewing's favor. A quiet room, a sealed envelope, a person with their eyes closed, drawing a place they were never shown. For 20 years, a superpower took that seriously enough to pay for it. And in the end, the most honest thing in the entire archive is not a revelation at all. It is the admission that, after all of it, no one could prove it worked.